You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Does Monday at the office feel like a storm? Not with Microsoft Copilot. That feeling when Copilot gets everyone up to speed instantly? It's sunny again. When Copilot simplifies complex data so your teams can act, that sun's shining on a beach. And when Copilot uncovers hidden insights, you're on that beach with your people, and you find buried treasure. That's Microsoft Copilot. Learn more at Microsoft.com/AI for all.
I'm Jason Palmer, one of the hosts of The Intelligence, The Economist's daily current affairs podcast. The Economist's award-winning shows make sense of what matters, from our special series on China's president to our weekly podcasts on business, technology, and American politics. Our journalists provide fair, in-depth reporting on the events shaping the world. To get the annual plan for less than $2.50 per month, search for Economist Podcasts Plus to start listening today.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War. On this episode of our Spanish Civil War interview series, I was joined by Dr. Morris Brodie. One of the major reasons I wanted to do this interview series was to talk to people who'd done research into the reactions of people outside of Spain to the events that were occurring within Spain. It can be challenging to research this myself given, the scale of the world, and so I was very excited when Dr. Brodie agreed to do the interview. Dr. Brodie is the author of Transatlantic Anarchism during the Spanish Civil War and Revolution, 1936 to 1939, Fury over Spain, which discusses the anarchist movements in Britain, Ireland, and the United States before and during the Spanish Civil War. This will be just the first of several interviews in which we discuss how various groups around the world viewed the Spanish Civil War. As always, you can find more information about the book, as well as a link on the interviews page of the website, which is in the show notes. Hello everyone and welcome to the Spanish Civil War interview series. Today I'm here with Dr. Morris Brodie from Queen's University in Belfast and the author of Transatlantic Anarchism during the Spanish Civil War and Revolution, 1936 to 1939, Fury over Spain. How are you doing today?
I'm very well. Wesley, how are you?
I'm doing fantastic and thank you for asking. So let's just jump right in here. Your book focuses on the anarchist movements in 3 countries outside of Spain. Within these nations, how numerous were the anarchist movements and where was their support primarily located?
So the 3 countries that my book looks at are Britain, the United States, and Ireland. And so the anarchist movements in each of these countries during the kind of mid-1930s had different styles. In Britain, most anarchists were grouped around small groups. The biggest kind of clusters would be in places like London and in Glasgow. London, the main group was the Freedom Group, which published a journal of the same name, Freedom, which was founded by Peter Kropotkin back in the 1890s. And in Glasgow, there were 2 groups known as the United Socialist Movement and the Anti-Parliamentary Communist Federation. There were also various other smaller groups dotted around the country in places like Bristol, Liverpool, and Plymouth. In terms of numbers, probably would only be about a few hundred if you're adding everyone together. Over in Ireland, the situation was slightly worse from an anarchist perspective. There was only a few scattered individuals in the bigger cities of Belfast and Dublin. The kind of radical movement in Ireland had been kind of subsumed a lot by the Irish Republican movement, and various anarchists were actually members of the Irish Republican Army at various points in their lives. So anarchism was certainly weakest in Ireland at this point. In the United States, the makeup is slightly different again. There's kind of 2 broad streams, I suppose you could say. There's the kind of labor-orientated anarchist, anarcho-syndicalist aspect, which is kind of the leftovers of the industrial workers of the world, the IWW or Wobblies. And they're kind of grouped around still in cities like Detroit and Chicago. Then you've also got an immigrant anarchist movement, people coming over from mainly Europe. So you have an Italian anarchist movement, you've got a Spanish anarchist movement, Eastern European kind of Jewish anarchist movement, Russian anarchist movement. And these kind of follow immigration patterns in that they're grouped quite a lot around the coast. So there's lots of groups in New York and places like New Jersey. There's also several groups in Los Angeles and San Francisco and other parts of California. And there's also a kind of Spanish anarchist community in Ohio and some of the Rust Belt areas. In terms of numbers, the best way of looking at that is through newspaper circulation. So the Free Voice of Labour, which was a Yiddish language anarchist newspaper, that had a circulation of about 150,000 in World War One. However, by 1934, this had dropped to about 5,000, and various other major anarchist newspapers in the United States, the circulation kind of varies between about 3,000. So it's in the thousands in terms of sympathizers. Active anarchist movement, it's going to be a little bit less than that. But certainly compared to Britain and Ireland, it's a healthier movement. But in comparison to Spain, where there's upwards of estimates about 1 million members of the CNT, the National Confederation of Labour, certainly much weaker compared to Spain.
When we look at the United States and in Britain, you mentioned that there were like groups of anarchists in various places. How much did they cooperate? Did they like see themselves pursuing the same goal, or were they pretty divergent in sort of their ideological beliefs at this point?
I mean, certainly they were all trying to go towards anarchism. They come from a kind of post-Enlightenment tradition, coming out sort of critique of the French Revolution is basically where the anarchist movement comes from, critique of kind of Jacobinism and authoritarianism. And there are various strands of anarchism which people disagree upon: anarcho-syndicalism, anarcho-communism, anarcho-individualism, and all these things. And so there's disagreements and kind of personal problems in that sense. But there's also lots of exchange between the groups in the different countries. There's migration exchanges. People move from different countries to another. For example, there's an Irish anarchist called Patrick Reid, who comes to Spain to fight in the International Brigades, who was born on the ferry to Liverpool in England from Dublin to Irish parents, lived in England, then went back to Dublin and Ireland, and then to the United States. So he's kind of bringing anarchist ideas with him. People like Rudolf Rocker as well and Emma Goldman, they would also bring anarchist ideas. And newspapers were exchanged. There were kind of ways that young anarchists, for example, who created a newspaper called Vanguard, they would send correspondence to an older English anarchist called Tom Keel, who lived in Whiteway Colony, which was a kind of anarchist-style colony in the south of England. And they would exchange literature, they would exchange correspondence, books. There was also, in terms of coordination, there was a thing called the International Working Men's Association, which is a kind of reimagining of the original First International, the famous one with Karl Marx and Mikhail Bakunin. This was formed in 1922 in Berlin, and various international anarchist organizations were affiliated to it. The CNT was the kind of major organization in that federation, and there were also ones like the Free Workers Union of Germany, central organization of the workers of Sweden, and there was also the Italian Syndicalist Union. The IWW never actually joined the IWMA, but there was certainly contacts between the two of them, and the IWW is kind of viewed as the American version of the CNT, I suppose. So, I mean, it's a transnational movement, and there's lots of information and idea exchanges between the different networks and different nodes, and this kind of increases with the advent of the Spanish Civil War.
Okay. So after the events of July 1936, which would kind of mark the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, how informed were all of these groups about events that were happening in Spain? And what was their kind of reaction to what was developing?
So There were initially contacts were kind of sporadic, I suppose you could say. Everyone was quite interested in what was happening in Spain because Spain had the biggest anarchist movement. It was kind of viewed as a kind of beacon of light for the international anarchist movement. It was difficult to get information out in the very start of the conflict, basically due to the war zone. But very quickly, the CNT managed to set up international bureaus to try to coordinate propaganda. So they set up the CNT FAI London Bureau in London, and then the North American Bureau in New York initially. There were also various newspapers which have been launched by anarchist groups in the Transatlantic countries, and these were dedicated to spreading the kind of anarchist perspective on Spain. There were also various organizations that were dedicated to fundraising. For example, the International Libertarian Committee Against Fascism in Spain, which was located in Detroit. They sent almost $10,000 between July 1936 and October 1937, which is over $180,000 in today's money. So there was sort of widespread fundraising due to like meetings, film showings, speaking tours. They organized picnics, various things in order to kind of spread anarchist propaganda effectively. And at the same time, anarchists were coming over to Spain to work for the CNT in their foreign language division, which was located in Barcelona, in Via Durruti, which is now Via Laietana. And these were in charge of sending out the CNT Bulletin of Information. So that was a translation of the original Spanish, which would get sent out to various countries throughout the world. There was several translations. There was an English language one, which was sent out to the Transatlantic countries. There was also a French one, an Italian one, Polish, Hungarian, even an Esperanto version as well. So there was a real effort to try to showcase the achievements of the Spanish anarchists to the rest of the world. And there was also a thing that appeared in 1937 called International Anti-Fascist Solidarity, called SIA, S-A-I. And this was similarly a kind of fundraising organization which connected groups across the world to try to raise money and raise funds to aid what was happening in Spain.
Hey, interesting that they had an Esperanto publication.
Yeah, I mean, the history of Esperanto is something that I find quite interesting. The kind of idea of an international language of the left, effectively. And certainly some of the earlier kind of international anarchist congresses in the 1920s, some of them were held in Esperanto. So people did kind of speak it, even though no one would have been a native speaker as such.
Some of us love history. Others used to or never did because history was presented as nothing but the rote memorization of names, dates, and facts. Basically, the story got left out, and that made history kind of suck. My name is Greg Jackson. I'm a university professor with a PhD in history, and bringing history to life is my passion. That's why I created my podcast, History That Doesn't Suck. I want to teach you everything you need to know about U.S. history, but I do so through stories. Let me tell you about George Washington begging his men not to mutiny against Congress, Clara Barton saving Union soldiers amid enemy fire, enslaved Frederick Douglass risking his life for liberty, and about so many other figures as their real experiences make industrialization, social movements, and even congressional debates and tax policy come to life. Subscribe to History That Doesn't Suck today, and join me, Professor Greg Jackson, every other week for a new episode, where I'd like to tell you a story.
All you need is a few minutes to start your day off with something historic when you listen to the This Day in History podcast. Every day there's a new episode for you to listen and learn about what happened that day way back when. Today could be the day a famous mobster met their end, or the first milestone for humans in space. Who knows what history today holds? Find out when you listen and subscribe to This Day in History wherever you get your podcasts. That's This Day in History wherever you get your podcasts.
On the communist side of the Civil War, there's the very well-known international brigades. They were formed by communist volunteers from all over the world. Were there equivalent groups of anarchist volunteers that went to Spain? I know you mentioned that there were individuals, but were there sort of large groups that volunteered?
There were groups that volunteered. In terms of absolute numbers of foreign anarchists, there's kind of various estimates, generally between about 2,000 and 3,000, compared to the kind of international brigades, which had around 35,000, I suppose, volunteers in total. So some of these anarchist volunteers would have joined the international brigades, but others would have joined the anarchist militias, which were the main kind of military force in Barcelona and Aragon during the early months of the war. So you had columns like the Durruti column, the Escaso column, which were named after well-known Spanish anarchist militants. You had colourfully named units like the Battalion of Death and the Death is Master militia. And various kind of militias which were made up of factories and kind of workers from different areas. So in general, anarchists would appear in Barcelona, not in a very organized manner, but they would head to the CNT headquarters in Barcelona, which is where the Foreign Language Division was headquartered, and they would basically ask what was going on, and then they would eventually get sent to these various militias. So in my book, I've found 115 named individuals from Britain, Ireland, and the United States who can either be described as anarchists or fought in anarchist militias. And about half of them joined the international brigades, and half joined either the anarchist militias or other left-wing militias, the same kind of party that George Orwell fought under, the POUM, the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification. And these militias were kind of unique in the history of warfare, I suppose you could say. They had a very different attitude towards military discipline than the international brigades or indeed the Spanish Republican Army. Some of the kind of stories you hear about them can be a bit shocking, perhaps. The idea of voting on military engagements, for example. If a commander had an idea about going to a certain attack ground, then occasionally this would be voted on, and if the volunteers or the militia members voted against it, then the action was cancelled and it wouldn't take place. There was no kind of military punishments, things like this, which a lot of other members of the Republican side were very unsure about, and worked hard to get the anarchist militias militarized and incorporated within the Spanish Republican Army, basically to give them a bit more control, because anarchist units were sometimes a bit unreliable. And it's kind of interesting hearing foreign volunteers, many of whom served in the First World War, for example, and seeing anarchist units in action and just thinking, what on earth is going on here? It's an ideal which was kind of forged in the chaos of war, but perhaps, practically speaking, there could have maybe been other ways of organising the militia. And the other interesting thing about the militias is that they actually allowed women to join. So there were two transatlantic anarchist milicianas, as they were known as, so female fighters. one of whom was called Grevel Texedorf. She was an English dancer and a poet. She actually became a kind of novelist afterwards, and she fought in the same unit as her husband, who was a German anarchist called Werner Druscher. And so these, the kind of idea of gender equality and the kind of revolutionary elan, which was such an important part of anarchist support, international anarchist support for the Civil War, and also the kind of how Spanish anarchists viewed their participation effectively in defense of the Republican state in many ways, and how they kind of squared that circle of supporting that fight.
Okay. When the war ended, it doesn't end well for Spanish anarchists. What was the reaction around the world? As you mentioned, like the Spanish anarchists were probably the most powerful anarchist grouping in the world, like the most numerous anyway. Was that demoralizing for other anarchists sort of scattered around the world?
Yes. In a word, yes. The course of the war is basically a kind of slow nibbling away at the revolutionary conquests of the Spanish anarchists. So you had the kind of the militias in full flow, and the collectivizations and land seizures and factory occupations, which kind of tried to put an anarchist society into practice. But this kind of the first few months of the war, this is what the international anarchist movement really concentrates on, and says, like, finally our ideal is being shown to be effective. But then after a few months go by, the central government kind of reorganizes itself and begins to push back against this revolutionary tide. And so the longer the war goes on, the more compromises the anarchist leadership makes with the Republican government. And initially, the international anarchist movement keeps fairly quiet about this. They think, well, it's in the middle of a war zone, so let's give them the benefit of the doubt. The CNT joins first the Catalan regional government, and then the central Republican government, which, for an anarchist joining the government seems fairly contradictory to their ideals. But there's only a real criticism of this after the May Days in 1937, which Orwell talks about in Homage to Catalonia, when the kind of revolutionary and anti-revolutionary forces kind of fight it out in Catalonia and on the streets of Barcelona. And from this point onwards, the international anarchist movement begins to be more vocal in their criticism of the CNT. And by the time that Franco's armies are victorious in April of 1939, the international anarchists many of them have had enough of the idea of the Popular Front, of a united front against fascism, and it really affects their views of what happens in the Second World War. And there's a split in the anarchist movement over whether to support the Allies against the Axis powers, and whether to wash their hands of the alliance and simply go out, take up an anti-war perspective similar to the majority of anarchists during the First World War. So there is a feeling of devastation when the Republic falls and when the cause is defeated. And many will leave the movement. Many will think that this is the ideal over, and they'll just move on, go out of politics altogether. But others are kind of strengthened in their ideal by the kind of crucible of Spain, and will spend the next 6 years either campaigning against the war, or in some cases joining armed forces or the resistance, and actually fighting against fascism in a different arena. There's a kind of younger cohort which kind of came of age during the Spanish Civil War in the international countries, and they largely continue their activism after Spain, even though from a theoretical point of view there's a lot of questions being asked about the practicality of some of the traditional tenets of anarchism. And if Spain gets tries it and can't complete the job, if you will, then how are we going to do this? So there's a lot of soul searching that goes on after 1939, which isn't really resolved until the rise of the New Left in the 1960s. Really, there's a lot of kind of intra-anarchist bickering over what happened in the Civil War and what went wrong, and it takes a long time to recover from that. But there is this idea that the anarchist movement just collapses after the end of the Spanish Civil War, which isn't really true. It's tempting to kind of view that as a kind of last wave, or the ending of the first wave of anarchism. But I kind of view the two waves. There's an idea of a classical anarchist school and the kind of modern anarchist school. But there's actually a lot of continuity between those two schools. And it's a lot of it is from activists who grow up basically through the Spanish Civil War and Revolution.
Okay, I know after the Civil War, was there a lot of anarchists who tried to leave Spain to other places in the world to sort of escape Francoist oppression? Did this have a noticeable effect on the anarchist movements in these three countries? Like, did Spanish anarchists come to those countries and have an effect?
Yes, there was a CNT exile movement which relocated to Britain in London during the end of the Spanish Civil War. A lot of the Spanish anarchists, were concentrated around Catalonia. And these effectively got pushed towards the French border. Then when they went over the border, they were rounded up and put into concentration camps by the French. And those who eventually got released, well, some of them didn't get released, but there was a kind of exile headquarters in Marseille. The Marseille group and the London group are kind of at odds with each other, because it's basically all to do with the politics of the Civil War. The Spanish anarchists who come to London are generally the ones who were in Madrid and fled by going via kind of the Alicante direction. And these were supportive of the Casado coup at the end of the Civil War, which overthrew the Juan Negrin government. So it was a kind of anti-communist coup. And so there's a lot of tension between those two groups over what they did in the last few months of the Civil War. And then there's also controversy over the behaviour of the French section, or the CNT in exile in France during the German occupation. There are also ones that come to the United States. The main kind of valve of emigration, or for Spanish anarchist refugees, it tends to be Latin America. So there's quite a few that go to Mexico and places like Venezuela, and the Dominican Republic as well has a large number coming. There is a Spanish anarchist exile newspaper which appears in the United States called España Libre, Free Spain, which is edited by a Spanish anarchist, Felix Martí Ibáñez, who's fled from Catalonia. And there's already quite a large Spanish diaspora community in the United States. So I suppose from that sense, the victory of Franco means that they can no longer return to Spain. It would be too dangerous. So effectively, the Spanish anarchist diaspora, or Spanish anarchist immigrant community becomes an exile community, and there's various kind of attempts to keep this exile community kind of alive throughout the 1940s and 50s and going on into the 60s and 70s. So I mean, they have a kind of cultural influence on the makeup of the anarchist movement in general in the transatlantic countries. If you look at memoirs of notable figures in the movement, they quite often talk about the groups of Spanish anarchists who they learned from about the Civil War and about anarchism in general. So there's a kind of wide reach of Spanish anarchism even after the defeat in Spain.
Excellent. Well, thank you for coming here on the podcast and answering some questions for us. It was really enlightening and interesting.
No problem. Glad to be here. Thanks very much.